Hello, it's Moira here and welcome to this Daisy Sampler Cal tutorial. This tutorial is going to demonstrate how to add your slip stitch round around your body section. The slip stitch round is worked around your body section and has two purposes. It frames the body section and is the initial round which allows us to move from working in rows to working in the round. In my muted version, I use colour D, as you can see that I've just demonstrated there, and because I used a 5mm hook in the last section, the body section, for this round I'm going up one hook size and using a 5.5mm hook. I'm going to explain to you how I get the numbers for the slip stitch round, because I get more questions about this round than any other. So looking at my pattern that I've already created in my body section, I have 61 stitches for the pattern. I have 59 rows for the pattern. I do not include the front border stitch and the last border stitch. Therefore, I know that I have 61 stitches along the top and the bottom and 59 stitches at each side. After my slip stitch round, I am going to have 63 stitches at the top and the bottom and 61 stitches at each side. These 2 extra stitches at each side come because we add 2 chains every side. So when we add our 2 chains to each corner, one is added to the row that we've just finished and one is added to the row that we're starting. As you can see where my corner chains are added there, and those 2 chains added on every side allow us to actually get to our extra stitches. So if we look at our pattern, at the side of the pattern, I always actually tell you the amount of stitches there should be at the side and at the top and bottom. And you can see at that first row, row 0, which is our slip stitch round, we have 63 stitches for the top and bottom and 61 stitches for the side. So back to the instructions. We start on the front of our work at the top of the body. It's the last row we worked on, and we're working in the 3rd stitch. I'm using a hook one size larger than I worked with on the body, so for me it's a 5.5 hook. So the 3rd stitch in from the side starts from the first pattern stitch, because remember we do not count that first border stitch. So that's 1, 2, 3. So ignore the first border stitch and count from the first pattern stitch in 3 stitches. So in the 3rd stitch I have inserted my hook into the top loop and I've joined my yarn with a chain stitch. Insert your hook into the top loop of the next stitch and work a slip stitch. Keep working slip stitches into the top loop only all along this row. It's quite difficult to get into that top loop. That's one of the reasons why I said to try to make your last row quite slack if you could. I'm just working my final few slip stitches here in this top row, and when I get to the last patterned stitch, that will be my last stitch on this row. So there you go, that's going to be my last stitch, because remember we do not work the last border stitch. We ignore that. So once you've worked that final stitch, that last pattern stitch with your slip stitch, you're now ready to add 2 chains to go round the corner. Insert your hook into that hole at the end of the row. It's just before the last border stitch, and you can then take the yarn from the end of the row that we've yet to weave in over the top of your stitch. So again, find the hole at the end of the row before the last border stitch and insert your hook with a slip stitch. If you're struggling to identify where the hole is, just pull that last border stitch very gently to the left and you'll be able to find the hole that way. Keep working slip stitches into the side row here all the way down till you get to the corner. You can pull multiple strands, those ends of yarn. You can pull multiple ones of them over like I've just done there, and that will actually enable you to work a little bit quicker. Now I've worked a few stitches, I'm going to let you see how neat the corner looks. So there we go, that's our 2 chains going round the corner, and we can see that our slip stitch is lined up very neatly with that last pattern stitch in our colour A. Just a couple of stitches to finish this particular row. So I'm just going to work that last 2 slip stitches that I've got to do. So there you go, one and then the other one. And now I've got a little bit of a strange looking corner here. It's because there is no last border stitch here. So that very strange stitch there is the hole that we're going to work into. So I'm going to do my last slip stitch on this row in there and then work 2 chains to get round the corner. And again, to identify the next stitch that I'm working into, no last border stitch again, remember it's still the same corner. So the first stitch I'm working into is immediately above that pattern stitch. It's quite a tight stitch because it was one of the very first stitches we created. This row you're working into is either your chain stitch row or your foundation double crochet row, and as such can be quite tricky to work into these stitches. You are working into the top loop of these stitches like you did with the top border. This can be a slightly trickier row to work into because it can just be a little bit tight, especially if you did chain stitches. And this is what the corner that we've just worked should look like. A nice edge around that pattern section, and we can see that slip stitch working along that very first row. Keep working your slip stitches all the way along the row, back loop only remember, until you get to the next corner. I'm just about at the end of this row. I can see that I'm at that pattern stitch, that last pattern stitch, and I'm going to work my last slip stitch in there before I work my corner chains. I'm working 2 fairly loose chains to go around the corner, and then I want to identify where the hole is for my first slip stitch. So to identify where that hole is that I need to insert my hook into, I'm pulling apart these first border stitches because that's what they are. So I can actually see there's an obvious hole there after the last pattern stitch where I can insert my hook into to create that first slip stitch. If you need to, keep pulling that border stitch over to the left so you can identify where the hole is that you need to insert your hook into. And just like on the previous side, when we actually had all those ends to work with, just pull them over the top of the stitch that you're working on. So again, when you insert your hook, take the yarn, the spare yarn, and put it over the stitch that you're working on, and you can do it more than one strand at a time. And now I'm finished a few stitches, I'm going to have a quick look at the corner. You can see that that first few stitches are lining up very nice and neatly with that line of trebles. I'm now going to carry on working the slip stitches in this row until I get to the next corner. I've a couple of more stitches now to go, and then I'm at my final corner. And there's the last slip stitch that I need to do before I work those 2 chains to go around the corner. And remember, we started on the third stitch in, so that's our first stitch that we're going to work our slip stitch into there above the pattern stitch. So that's stitch 1, stitch 2, and then the third stitch we've already worked into. So I'm just going to cut my yarn and finish off here, and I will create an invisible join over that third stitch. To create an invisible join, we first of all have to thread the needle with the end of the yarn. Then identify the V of the very first slip stitch that you worked. Insert your needle under the point of the V. Make sure it is the slip stitch and not the chain stitch. Pull your yarn through and then find the last stitch you worked, the rounded section of it, and insert your needle through the center of that rounded section. And then pull your yarn gently so you create a stitch very similar in size to the one that you actually have been working. If the stitch doesn't look similar to the size of the ones you've been already working, just pull gently on the yarn and that will line the stitch up. Then weave the yarn in at the back of your work to hold it in place. And your invisible join completes your slip stitch round. As you can see, that slip stitch round has framed your body section beautifully. This completes the tutorial for the slip stitch round, and I hope you didn't find it as daunting as you thought it would be. The next video in the Daisy Sampler series is section 2, motive 1. So head on over there for a demonstration of the next section in the Daisy Sampler.